Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I'm your host, Felicia Jackson, and today we're going to be exploring the concept of carbon neutral and what that means for business today. With growing awareness of the threat of climate change and the extractive and exploitative nature of the modern business economy, as well as a swathe of incoming government regulations, business executives generally have understood that they need to start addressing this challenge. But one of the biggest barriers to action is the confusion in the marketplace about what strategies to put in place, as well as how to communicate about them. And at the heart of this lies these concepts of net zero, carbon neutral, of what a carbon credit is and offsetting itself, where, how, and if to use such credits. So we've got this really complicated world with different terms. We've got companies like Microsoft. It once said it was carbon neutral historically, but as I understand it, that was only for scope 1 and 2 emissions and not the impact of the build, use and disposal of its products, or what we might call scope 3. The company's got net zero carbon and waste targets by 2030. And yet last year, its carbon emissions went up nearly 30%. Many large corporates seem to be backing off net zero targets because they're actually finding out it's a lot harder to achieve than they realized. So are setting targets like this a good thing? Does it matter what terms we use? And how important is it that we share an understanding of those terms? Are these targets encouraging climate action? Or are they allowing claims of action while doing very little, risking greenwash? And then that brings us to the ambiguities around offsets themselves. The last couple of years, we've seen scandals reporting that some offsets have little to no impact on emissions, or they're involved in pushing people off their own land. Then there's the question of whether we should actually be using offsets. Some see it as a positive thing because it's an approach that provides flexibility to industry, to agriculture. It means innovation and new approaches to carbon removals or avoidance technologies. But there are others who argue that it's just an excuse, that it's a means of making someone else responsible for emissions reduction, that you don't have to do anything internally. There isn't even agreement among the bodies responsible for setting the standards. There's a huge row that went on earlier this year at the Science Based Targets Initiative because what are emissions offsets supposed to be used for? Are they just for the emissions that you have under your direct control or for your value chain? The sustainability community itself is arguing, and that doesn't help anyone, especially in an average business, navigate the complexity of what can only be called a changing operational environment, let alone public expectations. But there's no question we have to move forward in some way, and that means we have to find a pathway through towards a more sustainable future. Today, we're lucky enough to be joined by Chris Hocknell, founder of 8versa, who's here today to talk us through some of these issues and the potential benefits of exploring the term carbon neutral. Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for joining us. Could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about 8versa?
Yes, of course. Thank you. So 8versa is a sustainability consultancy advisory firm. We started in 2008, and as you would imagine, sustainability was quite a niche pursuit back then, but obviously it's grown and become effectively mainstream, which is good news. We started off very much advising around built environment, infrastructure, which is obviously a huge consumer of natural resources and has huge impacts from a carbon and energy perspective. And then more recently, we've gone into things like net zero, carbon footprinting, certification schemes, and we've recently started advising on how conservation schemes can be designed to sequester larger amounts of carbon, etc., and things like that. So we're quite multidisciplinary in our path, and we're really here to help organisations of all stripes go from A to B to C, work out what on earth net zero or even carbon neutral means to them and make it happen on the ground.
Well, I love for lack of a better word, the complexity and the variety of solutions that you offer, because of course, one of the big parts of the conversation is what we're seeing with regulation is it's going far beyond carbon. In the UK, the biodiversity net gain is having a huge impact on the infrastructure sector. So the fact that you've got experience in all of these different areas really, really interests me. Now, to be fair to the audience, Chris and I have talked about this before. I'm a bit of a fan of the net zero term. But the reason I really wanted to talk to Chris today and have him talk to you is that he's a big supporter of the term carbon neutral. And I wanted to ask if you could explain a little bit about what you mean by carbon neutral, how it differs from net zero, because it's such a complicated area. Certainly one of the discussions about carbon neutral is, does it only talk about carbon or does it cover other greenhouse gases? It's brilliant to hear you talking about the conservation side of things, because biodiversity net gain is now a big issue in the UK, especially for infrastructure. So there are so many different elements that are all coming together. And I think for a lot of people, they're still at the stages of trying to understand what to do about carbon. So could you talk me through what you mean by carbon neutral and why you think it's such a useful term?
Carbon neutral effectively means a state where it can be applied to an organisation, so a company of any type, or an individual product. And it's basically the neutral part is where we have an amount of emissions that are emitted by the activities of a company or the production of a product, and that is a certain amount. And then we reduce it as much as we can, and then the residual amount of emissions we have, we need to go and purchase offsets, so carbon credits that are from various different activities. They could be on the other side of the planet. And as long as the amount of credits you're purchasing are equivalent to the amount of emissions you have, you can say you have effectively neutralized your footprint. So one minus the other equals zero. So that's the technical, I suppose, definition of what it means. We've had a big update that happened at the end of last year, and that's really where I suppose my more recent advocacy of the term is basically founded in.
The thing that interests me about that is that net zero is a term that kind of came out of the IPCC. And it's this idea that globally we're going to have the equivalent to net zero, whether that's reduction or removal of emissions. What's interesting to me is this idea that what you're talking about is the ability to apply the term to a product, to a company, rather than to a country or an economy overall. What would be the argument you would use to your board to say we need to be carbon neutral and that's the term that we need to use?
The key thing, well, I suppose this is where we draw the distinction between carbon neutral and net zero. Net zero, which I suppose the most latest and most comprehensive incarnation of it is what is, and the suite of documents and standards which have been produced by the Science Based Targets Initiative, and they're going sector by sector and giving a very distinct set of rules for that sector to follow before they can claim to be net zero, and that's a really positive thing. But the key difference is that net zero requires, typically, it does depend sector by sector, but say a 90% reduction in your emissions, so effectively eliminating those emissions by installing renewable technologies or substitutions in your supply chain, etc. A 90% reduction, and then you can only offset that residual 10%, and that's the maximum you're allowed to offset. So it places a much greater emphasis on the reduction and elimination of your carbon footprint first, whereas carbon neutral allows you to be on the way to net zero. And this is the key distinction. So previous definition of carbon neutral, which actually came out in 2010, and obviously the sustainability landscape was quite different back in 2010. And it was originally a British standard. So strictly speaking, it only applied to, broadly speaking, the UK. It was obviously used all around the world. But the problem we had was that we had inconsistent application of it. We had, I suppose, you mentioned some of the US tech companies, and Apple did I think they released a watch last year, if I'm not mistaken, which they claimed was carbon neutral. They had a rather liberal approach, shall we say, to the use of the term, and it kind of became you could define what was in and out of your footprint, and we actually ended up in a place where the precedent was set that instead of doing your scope 1, 2, 3, so just for clarity, scope 1 emissions are your direct emissions. So that's if you're burning gas to heat a building or as part of an industrial process. Scope 2 is the energy that you effectively buy in. So that's electricity from the grid. And then scope 3 is that wider supply chain, everything that your business or product consumes, all of the inputs and everything that makes the I suppose what it is that you sell, if it's a service or a product, makes it. And then we look at what happens downstream as well, if it's a product. So we have those different grades, and you can think of them almost like concentric circles. And scope 1 is direct, and it's what you can control. Scope 2 is, you're buying in electricity. It's a little bit further outside of your domain of control, but, you can maybe choose different suppliers. And scope 3 is that big supply chain where you actually tend to have relatively small influence and impact over it, because so much of it is happening multiple steps away. So that's the real problem with some of this, is that it's, with the definition of net zero, it's a good technical definition, but achieving, say, a 90% reduction in your supply chain when it's so big and so vast, and you might have thousands of suppliers all around the globe. It's a very, very, very big ask. And how we like to phrase this is that net zero is really for tomorrow, whereas carbon neutral could be for today. And I suppose we don't advocate choosing necessarily one or the other. We say, obviously, we all need to be working towards the long-term goal of net zero, but I think there's an element of pragmatism there, which is in reality, if you do that in the next 20 years, that would be a remarkable achievement if you're a company of any size or scale, really. 2040 is an incredibly ambitious, and 2050 is the kind of the backstop for a net zero achievement. So that in itself is a big goal. But in the meantime, we can be looking at carbon neutral. So if we are making those reductions and we're working towards a science-based reduction pathway, so we're achieving, what really that means is we're achieving annual improvements, year-on-year reductions. So we are tracking our footprint downwards towards the long-term goal. While you're doing that, that residual emission which you can purchase offsets for, that is a very constructive thing to do. Now, maybe get into the argument and the discussion around the validity, the efficacy of carbon credits and what they're actually supporting. But I think by and large, if you're applying a high level of quality assurance in terms of the carbon offsetting schemes that you're supporting, those schemes can be enormously beneficial for the communities and the ecosystems in which they're funneling capital into, hopefully to protect and conserve and maybe plant and put back and sequester and draw down carbon from the atmosphere. There can be an enormously beneficial exercise and piece of philanthropy. And I suppose ultimately the argument is, if we go for net zero, that's fine, but we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are some fantastic conservation and mitigation schemes around the planet. And we know about degradation going on in all different ecosystems around the world. And a lot of them are obviously in developing countries with very low capacity to fund them. And if we can funnel money effectively from relatively better off companies in the developed world into these conservation and restoration projects, that is a good thing. So that's where I suppose my advocacy of the potential for carbon neutral comes from.
I do like the idea of carbon neutral being what you need to be now, net zero as your end goal, especially because we've seen this backing off of net zero targets, because it's been, I don't know how to phrase this politely. There were a lot of companies that set net zero targets and were very excited about it and talked about it very, very loudly. And then they're sort of removing themselves from the groups they joined to get there very, very, very quietly. So no one notices, because it's so much harder than expected. I think there's also a challenge that because people don't really understand the terms and how they're used and what they mean, that you end up in a situation where people go, well, you need to be doing this, not that. It almost feels like there's a very binary approach to how you should approach long-term sustainability, long-term action on climate. Whereas we all know it's a widespread system problem, and actually taking a binary approach may not be the best way to accelerate action. What I think is also interesting is the timing, because obviously you mentioned the SBTI and the fact that as net zero, they're pushing towards, this idea of 90% reduction no matter what. Whereas the big scandal earlier this year was the announcement that they were going to allow offsets. And then that announcement got pulled and there's a row internally and they've taken the whole thing under advisement. And I'm fascinated by the fact that the PAS standard was updated at the end of last year, because it was early this year that the fight started. Sorry, shouldn't say fight. Disagreement started within the SBTI. So what do people need to look for?
The definition that was released in 2010 by the British Standards Institute is called PAS 2060-2060. And that was really what set the tone for a lot of the definitions of carbon neutral. And that was it was that standard really which became the precedent right up until November last year, which was the latest release. The key distinction there is, I suppose, what's really actually going to, I hope, put some more energy back into the carbon neutral term is the past standard was a British standard, so only applied to the territory, I suppose, of the UK, but it was used more widely. The latest standard is released under the ISO, the International Standardization Organization, so it's technically a global standard now, and we're very happy about that because any country that signs up to implementing ISO standards as their best practice way of doing things, strictly speaking now, the definition of carbon neutral applies to that jurisdiction, which is great because before, when it was just a British standard, you could, if you were a company in Australia, you could probably play very fast and loose with it. And I often saw a lot of commentary saying, this is what carbon neutral means to us effectively, and that reading it thinking that is not what it means, but you've obviously interpreted it for your own context. But now we have an international standard. It's very difficult, I think, to get away and gerrymander what that definition means. So from a sustainability advocate's perspective, very, very happy about that, because it stops that tweaking and that being economic with the truth, shall we say. But ultimately what happened on the past was we had scope 1, 2, 3, and you got partial footprints. So people would do, organizations might do scope 1 and 2, your gas, your fuel, and your electrical consumption, and then a little bit of scope 3, which might have been what's the waste from your office or something like that. And then when you did that footprint, you were probably only calculating maximum 25% of your total impact, and possibly less than 10%, because so much of your impact is in that big value chain. Big difference with the ISO standard, and I should have probably referenced that, but it's ISO 14068. That is the new standard of carbon neutral, if anyone wants to look it up. But the new rule is that it's been integrated with all the other best practice standards, which now requires a full scope 1, 2, and 3 measurement, which now that's aligned with net zero and all the other international best practice recommendations, saying you must measure all of your footprint. So that's been brought into alignment there. So that's very good. That's very exciting. And obviously now, as I mentioned, it applies to every jurisdiction that follows the international standards bodies. So we've really kind of stepped up the game there. And for me, that's a massive step forward. So I think it's going to be a lot harder for companies to wiggle out and interpret the rules in a way that suits them. I think the big problem, the big question mark, to be perfectly open about this, is how it's going to be policed. Because the problem with the past standard was it was just a standard, this is how it should be done. And then obviously, are we checking that companies are reusing it as they probably should or not? That there wasn't the enforcement there. There is a requirement in the new one to have what's called verification. So that means that if I'm a company and I do a footprint and I say it is a fully compliant ISO carbon neutral footprint, I should really go to a third party who has no vested interest in one way or another in what my footprint is, and get that audited, and they will verify that it actually is. I'm not marking my own homework and interpreting things in the most complementary way, etc. And there is actually a clear requirement in that in the latest ISO standard. So in many respects, the old issues have been tightened up. And as you mentioned, that was the end of last year, which was a slightly peculiar time for it to happen, because we had all this furore happening, and a lot of the criticisms around carbon neutral really kicked in about 2021. It was brought to the European Parliament for a discussion, and European Commission released a guidance note on it. The biggest high-profile court case is actually with Evian, and that's going through the courts in New York, US. And they have a carbon neutral label for their bottles of water. And there is a consortium of, I suppose, activists in environmental lawyers who are challenging that and saying it's a completely misleading term and it shouldn't be applied to that product. And everyone is saying, well, we followed the rules. We got a label from a company called the Carbon Trust. So we followed the rules, and then the activists say, no, you're misleading people. But that court case started prior to the issue of the latest standards. So it's a bit complicated, but I think now we have that new line in the sand. I suppose what we're advocating for is a reset. And, we want to reinvigorate and repurpose the term, and it's back, and forget the old past standard. Everything needs to be ISO. It's aligned with the science-based targets thinking, and that's got to be the only game in town. We need to forget past, it's gone.
Now this is
a reset.
Almost spectacular timing when you consider that the Azerbaijani government has just come out and said it's planning on trying to bring together green taxonomies globally at COP29. We've had, certainly in the UK, we've had Competition and Markets Authority set out rules for clarification of terminology. We've got consumer rules that are in place from the advertising watchdog. So there is this growing web of guidance and liability and clarity, because you mentioned it earlier, and this is something that I actually deal a lot with my students, is that if you've got a definition that can be defined differently by different people, that's not actually probably a definition. And that's what we need. We need, an even playing field. We talk about this in investment an awful lot, that new technologies need support because they need to even the playing field. But actually, in many ways, the fundamentals of our political and economic system are about what are the standards, what are the rules, what are the regulations? Are you all subject to the same standards? And if they start coming together and we start sharing a common understanding of what is expected when you do these things in the right way, then that could be transformational for the market as a whole, which is actually really exciting. I love your phrase to reinvigorate carbon neutral, because, I'll be honest with you, it's a term that I was very uncomfortable with because I'd heard it used so many different ways by so many different people. But actually, if you're saying this is what it is, this is how you audit it, and if you don't do it that way, you can't use it, there's nowhere else to turn. The only thing I would say is then, of course, that brings us to the thorny question of, okay, I've decided that carbon neutral is the way forward. That's the pathway I want to take through the issue of how my business should operate. But in order to achieve that, you're going to have to offset. So how do you do that? You talked earlier about the sort of quality assurance schemes, about the importance of putting money from, wealthy developed countries into projects in countries where that cash is not as easily available. Conservation is really important. Communities are really important. So is mitigation, different forms of adaptation. Are we going to talk about the importance of carbon avoidance versus carbon removals? So it's one thing to say you need a quality assurance scheme. How do you know if you're entering this market? Who do you turn to? What questions should you be asking to make sure that you're getting credits that work for your strategy, that work for your business? Because I think there are a lot of companies that are nervous about starting. They're nervous about engaging. They're worried that whatever actions they take, someone's going to attack them for them. So how do we go about preventing that?
Yeah, and all very valid points and concerns, I should add. So we've also gone through quite a lot of turbulence in the carbon crediting market, as I think most people are aware now. There's been multiple scandals in the last couple of years, and where most of those scandals tend to come from is in the avoidance market. By and large, there are some problems with the removal market, and I suppose just to clarify the two, avoidance is really where we have a historic course of action, if that's deforestation or land use change, for example, and then we're going to make an intervention, put up fences, get park ranges, whatever it might be, protect habitats and things and stop them being impinged upon and eroded. And to do that, we need funding, we need money, so we're going to generate carbon credits around that project. And then going forward, we predict we're going to be successful and save 1% per annum of erosion of this habitat, and then that obviously has a corresponding carbon value, and that's how that calculation works. The thorny issue is we have to estimate or prove a negative. We stopped this from happening, and obviously, as we know, proving a negative is pretty tough, and that's where we get into all of these kind of scandals of very elaborated and kind of over-optimistic scenarios about our intervention has stopped this happening and that happening. And that's the kind of notion of the phantom credits, these fictions that probably wouldn't have happened anyway, but we're trying to claim credit for. Those credits are quite substantially under attack, and I might just give a personal dig at one particular method or approach. The cook stoves one is one example where the idea is that, you go into communities that are still using, say, biomass from the local forest or mangroves to cook with, for example, and they're chopping them down, and that's what they're making cooking for the family with. And you might do an intervention there, and we bring in these cook stoves, so manufactured cooking devices, and we say, no, use these instead of going into the forest and cutting down trees, etc. And the presumption is we distribute 10,000 of them, and we assume 90% of them are going to be used, and then great. And then actually checking, if you go back a year later, how many people are using them? Are they really using them for every meal? And all of those inherent assumptions, things like that are pretty dodgy. And apologies to anyone who's invested in cook stove projects. But I think, those types of schemes are going to come under, and they are coming under intense scrutiny. And I think people are kind of, those who are in the know are walking away from them. And I think you can see the value of those types of schemes is deteriorating. But I think we should draw a distinction between things like that and perhaps the conservation model, which is something we've been asked to advise on a project in Nigeria recently, which is enormous plots of mangroves that are under quite heavy impingement and damage from DIY and illegal oil refining, people chopping down pieces of the mangroves for development and urban development and agriculture, whatever that might be. And it's really about how do we stop that happening? How do we, find employment for these people who are obviously just trying to survive, and it's not their fault. So things like that, and that would technically be an avoidance scheme. We're avoiding something happening, but I think you could make a very simple and clear argument that this needs to happen. And countries like Nigeria, whose maybe the state's entire budget might be 14 billion for millions of people, and obviously our government's quite happy to waste 14 billion on all manner of things, but that's the entire state budget that they do not have capacity to intervene and do these kind of things. So we need to build projects, and we need effectively money to come in from outside to take a stake in that. So we have to do that. The removal credits is afforestation, planting, putting back, and that's called removal because it draws carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and embodies it and embeds it in biomass or in the soil, perhaps, if we're looking at soil methodologies and things like that. And that's considered to be a better or more credible carbon credit because it has that sense of additionality. There was no tree there, now there's a tree. We can say, yes, that is a clear intervention which is credible and very obvious for anyone to see. But there is a lot of movement in this market, and I think standards are getting tightened up. We've just recently had a new guidance note released by the International Body on Voluntary Carbon Markets, and they're talking about, I think, removing or stepping back or at least very much tightening the rules around, say, energy projects. So, we install PV and claim a carbon credit. And
I hate to interrupt, Chris, but I thought they basically said they were just going to ignore about a third of the world's carbon credits because they didn't qualify under their rules.
Yes, that's part of that is part of the problem with that.
So you were being polite.
Yes, I'm being very kind to them. But I think there's a lot of turbulence in this market, and we're getting things popping up like that. I think we're going to I hope at least we're going to land in a stronger and better position in a few years' time. There's the problem at the moment, these quality standards, which I suppose I'm referring to, and I would probably say that one of the best organisations to go to for this is the University of Oxford. They're net zero. I think the website's Net Zero Climate, but they've got a body and a team that are constantly putting out white papers, and it's really, really top quality stuff, and it's all made publicly available, which is excellent. But they have a document that came out this year, a revised document called the Oxford Principles for Carbon Credits, and they set a lot of quality standards. And I would encourage anyone who's purchasing carbon credits should really follow this, because it's the people behind it are really excellent caliber, very, very high and respected in their field, and they really lay down the quality approach to carbon credits. The issue is this is like best practice. This is what you should do, but there are still carbon credits being issued that are shaky, perhaps, shall we say. And what we need, I think, is this kind of overhaul in the standards market to incorporate things like the Oxford Principles of Best Practice. That needs to become the benchmark for generating a carbon credit rather than, it's a nice to have. I hope that happens. Maybe you can imagine there's lots of vested interest and it might not, but that's what we need to happen.
That's a really useful end goal, but I'm going to bring this back to carbon neutral and net zero, because the end goal is to have this overhauled market with high integrity that people understand, where counterfactuals are out of the market, that, there's proper reporting on data. But at the moment, if you haven't got the time and the space to go and do independent research and understand what to look for that's recommended by the experts that wrote the Oxford Principles, I suppose I'm asking on a really simple level, what are the basic things you should be looking for in a carbon credit? Now, you mentioned this idea of projects are set up, but then you go back 2 years later and find out that the percentage of change wasn't implemented. What would you say to me if I'm just going, right, I have just realised I have found a bigger carbon footprint than I realised and I want to offset it. I need it to be as cheap as possible, but I also need it to be as credible as possible, because there's always a trade-off between the two. And, in a perfect world, what we want is people to be paying the actual social cost of carbon, which I think the EPA set at, was it $290 last year? High cost carbon credits today, if you're not talking technological removals, are $60. You can buy them for $4. But I'm kind of figuring if you're buying them for $4, it's probably not going to be the highest quality credit. I'm not saying it's not for anyone out there who is selling $4 credits, but I'm asking you, Chris, if you were giving me a piece of advice, what should I be looking for as a business trying to buy credits?
The fundamental principle, I suppose, is looking for, and the problem is you need to have a level of, I suppose, understanding and technical, which obviously is, I suppose, at the heart of the matter here. But the key things we would look for, if someone said, find some high quality credits is the risk of reversal. So how quickly could it be undone and undermined? So we really want things that are really fundamental, like almost permanent, they almost can't be reversed or very hard to be reversed. And obviously make, I suppose, actions that you always have a positive and you have a negative, an upside and the downside to any kind of intervention where the potential for negative impacts is lower than, say, an alternative scheme. So they're probably two fundamental principles. Now, how we do that at the moment is we rely on probably three bodies to do that for us. And there's VERA, VERRA, and then the gold standard. And then there's multiple other ones, but they're the big guys. And they're the ones that have all the standards and they're the ones that do the verification. There are some projects that they've endorsed, which have obviously turned out to be a bit bogus. And that's been a bit of a problem. That's undermined their reputation as a body, because before you would just say, look, if it's got a VERA stamp, that's quality assured, and you don't have to dig into it yourself. But by and large, if one of those big bodies, there's a body called ICROA, which is the International Carbon Registry, and they make sure that the people who are issuing credits follow a certain standard. So there are these layers of kind of quality assurance, but it isn't perfect, and that's the thing.
One of the things I would jump in with that is that some of the projects that have proven problematic are using methodologies that were designed 20 years ago. And we've been talking today about the fact that there is a shift happening, almost a norm shift of people's level of expectation of robustness that is happening now. So when you consider that things were being put together with a lot less knowledge 20 years ago, it's understandable that and I do, because I'm a big fan of effective standards and certification, but it's not like they haven't stood up and said, yeah, we're actually addressing these. We're trying to look at this. We're trying to understand what happened. And I suppose there's part of me that always vacillates between wanting everyone to be perfect, but like, who is perfect? And actually just recognizing that people are doing their best with the tools that they've got. And because I think that's actually how it feels for many businesses who are trying to move forward in this direction and try and take action. And as I mentioned earlier, frightened of doing it wrong.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very valid point. It's difficult because, the general rule, one of the things actually I should mention, which is in the carbon neutral standard, which is ultimately comes from the IPCC, is that they call it a vintage, but it's, how old is your carbon credit? And basically you shouldn't accept a carbon credit that's more than 5 years old.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
Yes. And obviously as time moves by, then I suppose the idea is it's incorporating more and more recent kind of, it's a bit difficult because you can imagine if you set up a great scheme that was maybe under a prior standard, which maybe isn't considered to be as up-to-date and credible. You don't want to throw them under the bus and say your scheme's worthless. But that's what they're trying to advocate there. And I suppose over time, obviously, that will catch up with best practice now. So that's what they advocate. And I think that's, broadly speaking, pros and cons, and is a good thing to do. And so if you're looking to buy a carbon credit, you look at something that's in a relatively recent generation. Realistically, the closer we are to today's date, you could probably take that as an indicator of quality to some extent. And I'll probably say to anyone who's buying them, which is probably going to run a little bit counter to the carbon neutral potential, is that probably best to look at quality over quantity. And, if you were going to say your footprint was 1,000 tons as an organization, maybe you could go out there and buy 1,000 carbon credits at rock bottom price, $14. Maybe they're not as high quality. Or you could find a scheme of which maybe there are only 500 credits available. So half of your footprint, but they're more expensive and a higher quality. In that instance, I would probably say if you have more faith and confidence in this other scheme, don't offset all of your emissions. If your budget can only stretch to buying 500 of the higher quality rather than 1,000 of the lower, prioritize quality over quantity, and that's the better thing to do. And hopefully you can be more confident that you're having downstream benefits and impacts. So that's probably one key thing to consider. But hopefully with the mechanism of vintage and the preference for more recent credits, as the standards increase and improve, that will help raise all the quality.
One of the things I love about that is it brings me back to something that always is a focus for me, which is what's the story you're telling? Because if you're buying 1,000 credits and offsetting it and boom, done, you've just bought your $14 ones, that's great. But there are going to be people who are going to say, well, why did you choose those? And if you say, I chose 500 of these because it's offsetting half my credits, but I'm putting money towards education, healthcare, economic development, changing operational patterns, shifts in the supply chain, the impact of that is so much greater. I must admit, the vintage thing I wasn't aware of, and it is something that interests me because sometimes it's the underlying detail rather than the vintage that's of most interest. Because I remember coming across projects a few years ago where, afforestation projects were being pitched. This is absolutely marvelous. Give us money for your airplane flight, and we're going to put money into planting new trees. And then you find out that the forest was planting pine trees in an area where pine trees don't thrive. And you're going, okay, that's not paying any attention to the ecosystem. I mean, obviously, that's why experts like you are necessary to help companies actually look under the hood, for lack of a better phrase. But it's that thing that I think everyone needs to feel they've got a grip on what they should be looking for, because the first thing you need to start any journey is understanding what questions you need to ask.
Yeah, very true. Absolutely, yeah. I think one of the problems is the market has contracted quite a lot because of turbulence and scandal and that kind of thing. The carbon market contracted quite a bit last year. I think this is going to annoy a lot of people, but to be honest, I suppose it's like anything. It's like food or clothes or any kind of, if you're buying ridiculously cheap, there's probably a question you should be asking is, why is that so cheap, And this is, just rough rule of thumb, so take it with a healthy dose of salt. From our advice now, participation in advising on how to set up some of these conservation schemes, we can't set up a conservation scheme probably for less than $30 per ton, because we find if you're going down into these lower, say the teens and things like the, $14, $15, $18, which was quite a standard price for an avoidance credit a few years ago, we just can't maintain the quality standards and the assurance and having people going out there every year to look through things and report. And so I think price is probably the first point. If it looks too cheap and too good to be true, it probably is.
It's like fast fashion.
Well, exactly, yeah, and it's exactly that. And obviously, if you can buy a T-shirt for $3, you're probably worried about how it's been made. And I think the carbon credits do have that kind of dynamic as well. Yeah, I'm hoping things are changing and they are improving. It's a difficult market, it really is, but I think the quality over quantity is much more important, even if that means you don't get your certification. I think just as an organisation, you need to be able to stand by your decision and say, this is what we chose and this is the reason why. And I think sometimes we get a bit too caught up in targets and strap lines and carbon neutral, net zero and things like that. I think, I'd much rather a company had a defensible, credible, very low risk carbon reduction strategy that maybe only achieved 20% reduction than someone who maybe went out and bought a job lot of carbon credits and claimed carbon neutral. I would probably argue that done the right way, that could be more impactful than the latter. So I think we just need a little bit of nuance when we're evaluating what companies are doing and not just jump to do you have the strap line? Do you have the buzzword?
There's that wonderful old phrase that's used over and over again, but the reason it's used so much is because it makes sense, which is don't let the perfect get in the way of the good, because none of us are going to be able to get to that perfect place when we start. But actually being authentic and honest and accountable about the choices you make actually will not only mean that you're doing a better job of moving in a consistent and replicable way, but it means you're actually being honest about what you're doing. You're actually able to say to people, we're doing our best and this is what we're doing and this is why we're doing it. And that's the reason we're doing it the way we are, which I think, again, on a greenwash front, you've got nothing bad to say when someone's actually explained what they're doing.
Yeah, I think you get a bit suspicious, don't you, when it's a bit murky and you're trying to what you're actually saying, what you're doing. I think when you're hiding behind things, you're not saying this is what it is, warts and all type. As someone who has to navigate kind of company disclosures and sustainability reports quite often, you can generally get a sense quite soon as to how they've approached this. And when it's very buried and you've got to, what are these Scope 3 emissions? How much is from their purchased goods or whatever it might be, and you're searching through a document trying to find it, that's a really bad sign. And, there are some brilliant examples out there of companies who just say, this is it. We admit this isn't so good, we're working on it. Yeah. And it's about that openness and transparency. And I think companies obviously are worried that if they are too transparent, someone will leap on them. But I think we just got to be a bit more, give them a bit more slack on that. Those who are being transparent, even if there's a little bit, maybe not as palatable, we should give them the respect that they actually told us. So maybe that, and if they're working on improving it, then maybe credit where credit's due there.
Credit where credit's due is the perfect line to end our conversation on. Chris, thank you so much. I've really, really appreciated talking to you. It's been fascinating, and I hope it's been useful to our readers. If you're getting involved in this journey, then I hope you've learned something. And if you want to talk to Chris or find out more about 8Versa, we'll put their contacts in the show notes. Thank you for joining us today. And don't forget to follow us on socials and subscribe to Shaken Not Burned wherever you get your podcasts.